Well, it's a big day. 50 years ago, this became a pivotal movement. Some might say the biggest part of the civil rights movement, and it led to the Voting Rights Act, and people were systematically denied the right to vote around here, throughout the South, and that was a historic change. There's no doubt about it, and people risked their lives on this day. People lost their lives in that effort, and it's important to remember that. A lot of it's not pretty, a lot of it's painful to see and remember, but we need to remember.
In your thoughts about voting rights today, where they stand, and what you think needs to be done to protect voting rights for everyone? Well,
I have to say that the South is improved tremendously, and I don't think its commitment on voting rights is any less than any other area of the country, which is what the Supreme Court found in the Section 5 case. So they knocked out part of the Voting Rights Act, but not the heart of it. The federal government still has the power to prosecute, investigate anyone that violates the Voting Rights Act. So as we go for voting rights, and as we go forward, maybe there's some other things that need to be done, but it doesn't have, I think fundamentally the Supreme Court was correct in its ruling.
How do you increase African American voting?
Well, it's pretty good. I mean, all of us need to vote better. But I think in this area, you'll see African American vote to be pretty strong election after election.
That's Alabama Republican Senator Jeff Sessions speaking at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Saturday, the day that President Obama stood there as well and gave a major address. To talk more about the state of voting rights in Congress, we're joined by Ari Berman of The Nation. He traveled to Selma this weekend with the congressional delegation of 100 Congress members and senators. His latest article is headlined 50 years after Bloody Sunday in Selma, everything and nothing has changed. His forthcoming book titled Give Us the Ballot. It'll be out in August. Welcome back from Selma to Democracy Now!, Ari.
Thank you,
first, if you can address what Jeff Sessions said.
Sure. Well, the first thing to remember is Jeff Sessions has a long and very troubling record on voting rights. When he was an assistant U.S. attorney in Alabama, he prosecuted black voters for voter fraud in Selma. They were later acquitted, but it was a very, very controversial trial there. He was nominated for a federal judgeship by the Reagan administration, and he was blocked by the Congress, partially because he had wrongfully prosecuted these black voter fraud activists. So I think his position on the Supreme Court's ruling, the fact that he agreed with the Shelby County decision, is not surprising in light of his long opposition to voting rights.
And again, Shelby is, in a nutshell.
Shelby County, what it did is it invalidated the formula that said that those states with the worst histories of voting discrimination had to clear their voting changes with the federal government. So states like Alabama, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Mississippi, they had such a long record of voting discrimination, they had to clear their voting changes with the federal government to prevent discrimination in the future. Now that the Supreme Court has invalidated that formula, they don't have to clear their voting changes anymore.
I want to go back to Republican Senator Jeff Sessions again at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Saturday. Senator Sessions, one last question. The question of why not make voting easier for people in this country? Let people vote early, longer days, the whole issue of opening up the voting process so that people can feel welcomed into the process.
Well, I'm uneasy about this long pre-voting. Things happen between 2 weeks or more to the election day, and oftentimes people are urged to go to vote and vote before they're ready to vote. And so I think there's nothing wrong with voting on election day. That's the way we've had since the founding of the Republic.
Especially
I just told you
for poorer people when it's hard to, in a working day, be able to get out and vote.
You can vote absentee, and if you're employed and can't go to work, you can vote absentee, and you can vote absentee if you're ill or have a number of other reasons. So I'm just not for extending the time. that's an unusual thing that
Same-day registration, more
no, I
places.
think same-day registration is very dangerous.
Because?
Well, because it can allow fraud to occur and people can vote more than once.
What about felons? People who've been in prison, served their time. In some states, they're allowed to vote. In some states, they're allowed to vote from prison. But in many states, they lose that right forever.
Well, it depends on the conviction and depends on the state, but that's historically been the rule. You've been convicted of a serious offense. Most states at one time or another have denied people the right to vote.
What is Alabama's policy?
Alabama, you can get citizenship restored, I think, after you complete your time in jail for some crimes, but I don't really know the details of it.
That's Alabama Republican Senator Jeff Sessions, Ari Berman.
Well, I think his comments are indicative of many Republicans on voting rights now, which is they don't want to support policies that make it easier to vote for one reason or another, largely claiming voter fraud, even though there's no evidence that things like early voting lead to voter fraud. And just to give you a little bit bigger picture here of what's happening nationally, 395 new voting restrictions have been introduced in 49 states from 2011 to 2015. Nearly half the states in the country, actually half the states in the country, have passed laws making it harder to vote since 2011. That's a really dramatic effort to limit access to the ballot. That's the greatest attack on voting rights since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965.
There were many Democratic senators and Congress members, and we talked with a number of them and played it yesterday. But Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins was also there.
There are a number of Republicans who are here, including Senator Tim Scott, who's the only African-American senator from South Carolina. He was the one who invited me onto this trip, and I have to tell you, it has been so moving. I feel like all of us have learned so much, and this truly has been a pilgrimage.
Your thoughts on voting rights today and what can be done to ensure voting rights for all?
Well, it's absolutely critical. One of the facts that I learned on this journey was that in one county in Alabama in 1965, the population was 80% African American, and yet not one African American was able to register to vote because of the many barriers. We never want to go back to those days. The right to vote is certainly absolutely fundamental to our democracy and must be protected.
Are you critical of the Shelby decision of the Supreme Court?
You know, this trip is going to cause me to take more of a look at that decision. It's one that doesn't affect my part of the country, just certain southern states, and I think it's important to recognize those states have changed a lot over time, but I have to look exactly at what the impact is. But we certainly don't want to in any way weaken the protections that ensure that every American, regardless of race or gender or creed, has the opportunity to register to vote.
That's Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins. Ari Berman, the significance of what she's saying, that this trip may force her to look a little differently at voting rights, how important is this?
I think it's significant. One of the things I realized in traveling with the members of Congress, a lot of them had never been to Selma before on both sides of the aisle. A lot of them hadn't really thought that much about the Supreme Court's decision.
So you are an embedded reporter with the Faith and Politics Institute, which is what?
It's an organization that supports this congressional pilgrimage every year to Alabama and also related congressional pilgrimages around the issue of faith, and they're trying to get bipartisan delegations to places that are historically significant. And so Susan Collins is basically saying, I hadn't thought about this much before. I'm going to think about it now. She told me that she was more sensitive now that barriers can prevent people from voting. That's what people have been arguing for years, that these new voting restrictions do. The message didn't seem to have gotten across to many Republicans. None center sponsoring legislation, for example, that would restore the Voting Rights Act in Congress. It has 0 Republican sponsors in the Senate. Maybe as a result of this trip, people like Susan Collins will sponsor that legislation, and they'll take this issue more seriously.
And what is the legislation? How, many people on the bridge were saying what counts is not so much today, remembering what happened 50 years ago, but what happens when these Congress members go back.
There's a bill called the Voting Rights Amendment Act. It has bipartisan support. It's sponsored by Jim Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin and John Conyers of Michigan in the House, and by Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont in the Senate. It restores Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, so it creates a new formula of which states have to approve their voting changes with the federal government based on recent voting rights violations. So if a state has 5 violations, it has to clear their voting changes with the federal government. That formula is current, which the Supreme Court said the old formula was not, and it's not regionally specific. If any state, no matter where it is, California, New York, Vermont, or Alabama, has 5 violations, they have to approve their voting changes. So it's a modern formula. It's not as all-encompassing as the previous formula. The legislation has serious flaws, but it is an attempt to restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act and also to act as a deterrent to states that are passing new violations, knowing that if they do restrict voting rights, they could be covered under the new Voting Rights Act.
How does the U.S. compare to other countries in the world when it comes to voting?
Oh, we're horrible. I mean, first thing, voting rights is an issue in the U.S. in a way that it isn't in other countries. Other countries have much higher participation. They make it much easier to vote. It's far less politicized. There's far less money in the political process. So for such an advanced democracy that's exported democracy supposedly all around the world, we have one of the worst records of democracy at home.